Hello, welcome to Sociology of Crime, Week 4, Lecture 2. My name is William Wood. This lecture, we look at early physiological theories of crime, continuing from our discussion last lecture on early biological theories and their role in eugenics policies in the US, the UK, and Australia. So, early psychological theories developed as well, in part, out of the Italian school. So Lombroso was in many ways considered the originator of the biological deterministic approaches to understanding or explaining crime. But this figure here, René Garofalo, is equally influential in many ways for his early approach to looking at ways in which diseases of the mind might affect social action, including things like deviant or criminal behavior. So Garofalo is a student of Lombroso. He's opposed, however, to the belief that criminality was the result of free will. He's very much influenced by this figure that we looked at in the last lecture, Herbert Spencer. Critical of arbitrary or legalist definitions of crime. Remember, in week 1, we talked about some of the problems with formal or legalistic definitions. So he was one of the first to argue that there needs to be a more scientific explanation of crime, not simply depending on the state or policymakers to define criminal activity. He proposes in the place of this theory of what he calls natural crime. Natural crime, he argues, violates two principles or altruistic sentiments common to people in most society: property and piety. So the altruistic sentiment of property, my things, however defined, and my right to them, including things like business opportunity, but personal items, and my safety or security, and by extension those of those around me, my family, and so on. So Garofalo extends this concept of atavism that we spoke about, Lombroso's concept of atavism, extends this from a Lombrosian biological framework to include psychological as well as physical characteristics. He cites a lack of solid evidence for anthropological criminology. In fact, this continues on some of the work from the later biological theorists we looked at, who also concluded that there was little actual scientific evidence for physiological differences that would explain involvement in criminal activity. This is why many of those biological theorists went below or underneath the skin to the world of genetics, to the world of heredity. So he argues that crime is likely a result of psychic or moral abnormalities. So he heads a different direction. It's not likely to be, or heredity may play some part, he says, but it's likely to impact diseases of the mind or psychic or moral abnormalities, he says. Heredity then probably plays a part, a larger role in this than the environment. So he divides criminals into 4 categories. Extreme, this is murderers, rapists, whatever. It says altruism for these types of individuals is wholly lacking, devoid of probity or piety, so they should be executed or permanently removed from society. Violent criminals, altruism mostly lacking. These also tend to be opportunistic, should be incarcerated or banished, he says. Thieves or other criminals on this level, and he classifies them into different types of thieves, some driven by necessity, others by lack of probity, and punishment should follow a degree of probity. He says that those driven by necessity probably deserve lesser punishment, more opportunity in some sense. Those, on the other hand, that exhibit less altruism should be punished with more severely. And lascivious, those driven by extreme urges, lacking not piety but moral perception, punishment should vary for such offenders, he says. switching from this Italian school, for which Garofalo was really the strongest of the proponents of psychological approaches. The other the other psychological approach is really difficult to underestimate, or to really difficult to not recognize the extreme influence that this had in early and mid-20th century psychological approaches to crime and deviance as psychoanalysis. So we will only cover a tiny bit, one, because you have a whole semester on crime and psychology, where you'll cover this in more detail. And two, because the things that we want to cover in this class are less just a repetition of what you learn in psychology of crime, and more a sociological perspective or critique of those. So undoubtedly, most of you know the originator of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, develops what is called a theory of personality. Right? And this isn't a literal, there's not an id, an ego, and a superego literally inside of us, he says. He uses it to describe the development of personality. For Freud, the id is the location of the basic drives. The ego is this reality principle. The superego is the conscious or internalized social control function. And the personality then functions in normal individuals, argues Freud, by means of the ego mediating between the internal desire of the id, the drives, right, and the external desire of the superego. Superego is often described as the internalized voice of your parents or teachers or other people telling you what you should do and shouldn't do. So crime and deviance, from a Freudian perspective, operate as a matter of, normally, as a matter of unconscious desires, unresolved conflicts, unrecognized fears below the level of everyday life. Right? So deviance and crime is a part of deviance, thus represent in a large sense those things that are culturally forbidden or unrecognized traumas, usually, argued Freud, emerging from childhood experiences. So Freud's conception of the human psyche, often referred to as the iceberg metaphor. I hope this isn't the first time you're seeing it. You should have been exposed to this in high school and even at first year, where our conscious mind is really only a small part of the preconscious and unconscious. Many of the things that drive us or compel us or push us in directions exist below the surface in relation to, as we said, things like childhood trauma or unresolved conflicts with parents, or a lack of development of particular aspects of our personality. So this plays a range, sorry about that. This plays a range of, this results in a range of types of behaviors far beyond simply crime and deviance. For our purposes, however, there are some fairly specific types of developmental problems that result in terms of personality development, that result in specific criminal or deviant activities. So psychoanalytic theories of deviance, Freud argued that in some cases the id might be overdeveloped or the superego underdeveloped, leading to personality disorders, antisocial behavior, compulsive behaviors. So overdeveloped or uncontrolled id often resulted in unsocial or aggressive behavior, Freud argued. Overdeveloped superego, things like excessive timidity and repression, possibly compulsive behaviors or desires to be punished. Freud further postulated that the development of the id, ego, and superego were related to stages of personality development, which I mentioned just on the last slide, including oral, anal, and phallic stages. Unsuccessful development through any of these stages, he argued, may lead to repression and abnormal or deviant behavior. Examples include things like the Oedipus complex in boys, the Electra complex in girls. Well, for Freud, this was more a theory, a general theory of behavior. He had some focus on criminal behavior, and specifically. But this was somewhat left to later theorists, Alexander and Healy's work, for example, where they more directly apply psychoanalysis to deviance and crime. Their groundbreaking, this very influential work, The Roots of Crime, They suggest that manifest criminal actions were the result of latent personality disorders. Again, I don't want to spend a significant amount of time going down psychoanalytic or more contemporary psychological approaches, since you spend so much time in your psychology of crime class. I do want to mention them in brief for our discussion of maybe some of the overlap between sociological and psychological theories, or some of the ways that sociology has critiqued these, or things that are left unexplained from a sociological perspective. So some of the criticisms and problems with psychoanalytic approaches include the difficulty of empirically establishing the existence of primary concepts of the id, the ego, the superego, corresponding pathologies. Right? They're impossible to empirically identify. And many critics have pointed out, in some ways, sociologically, how culturally constructed they are. Right? The id, the ego, and the superego as historical constructions of a particular time and place, and not empirically verifiable in any case. The argument that because a person commits a crime, because he or she has some unconscious or subconscious personality conflict, this argument is circular, and that the problem to which a solution is sought is itself used as the proof that the explanation is correct. This is the problem of tautology, that the crime itself is evidence of the underlying personality disorder. The underlying personality disorder is used to prove that the person is deviant or abnormal, resulting in criminal behavior. Lack of attention to social and environmental factors not related specifically to the personality of the offender, things like poverty, race, social class, and so on. This fits in with a larger critique of trait theories in general, which we'll look at the end of the next lecture, where many sociologists have rightly pointed to the problem that if crime is a result of individual traits or differences, we would expect to see it more randomly distributed among variables of social class, gender, and race, ethnicity, etc. But in fact, it's quite patterned. And this has always been one of the dominant reasons for sociological explanations of offending, is the extreme degree of patternness within these individual cases. Okay, that concludes our shorter lecture 2 on early psychological theories of crime. So our last lecture for this week, we'll look at some more contemporary perspectives. We'll look at the elusive quest for the criminal personality, and we'll end with some criticisms of contemporary biological and psychological trait theories, and I look forward to speaking to you then.